Hey everyone, go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher. Tonight, we're drifting back to one of those long, gray chapters of history that no one really wants to remember, but everyone somehow does. The Great Depression. The name alone sounds like something your grandfather would sigh about while staring at his untouched cup of coffee. It began in 1929. Officially, that is, when the stock market decided to leap dramatically off a cliff. People always imagine that moment as this thunderous crash. But for most folks, it didn't come with fireworks. It came quietly. A newspaper headline here. A neighbor losing his job there. And slowly, a thick fog of worry that seemed to settle over everything. You might picture it all in black and white. And honestly, that's not far off, because the 1930s had that washed-out, gray feeling even in real life. The clothes were faded, the buildings dusty, the air dry and tired. It was a decade when even the sunlight seemed a little bit worn out. If you'd been alive then, your mornings would probably start early. No alarms, just the natural rhythm of necessity. The rooster crowing, the baby crying, the sound of a train in the distance. You'd pull yourself out of bed, not because you were ready to face the day, but because you had to. Let's imagine you're living somewhere in the Midwest, maybe Kansas. Flat land as far as you can see. The kind of place where the horizon feels like it's slowly backing away from you. You wake up, your mouth dry from the dust that sneaks in through every crack. There's a thin film of dirt over everything. The table, the window, even your thoughts. Breakfast isn't much. A slice of stale bread. Maybe a bit of lard spread across it, if you're lucky. Coffee if you can stretch the last of the grounds. If not, maybe roasted chicory root or just hot water pretending to be coffee. You don't complain. No one does. Complaining takes energy, and energy costs calories. And calories are expensive. The newspapers talk about unemployment lines in cities like Chicago or New York. But out here, it's not much better. There are no jobs to line up for. You just wait and hope the land forgives you for whatever you did to it. Because here's the cruel irony. During the Great Depression, the land itself also gave up. The Dust Bowl swept across the Midwest like some slow-motion apocalypse. Farmers had plowed the soil so thoroughly during the good years that it had nothing left to hold it down. Then came the drought, and the wind, and before long, everything turned to dust. The sky darkened not with rain, but with dirt. There were days when you couldn't see your own barn from the porch. People wore damp rags over their faces. They stuffed wet towels under the doors to keep the dust out. Mothers would hang sheets between rooms, hoping to create one clean space for their children to breathe. But the dust always found its way in. It always did. At night, the wind howled through the cracks in the wood. Children coughed in their sleep, and the adults lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer they could keep going. If you've ever had one of those nights where you couldn't stop worrying about the future, just stretch that feeling across an entire decade. Let's drift over to the cities now, because not everyone lived on a farm. Some people tried to find opportunity in the industrial towns. And by opportunity, I mostly mean disappointment dressed up as hope. Imagine you're in Chicago in 1932. The streets are busy but strangely quiet. There's movement but not much purpose. Men in worn-out coats stand in lines that curl around city blocks. They're waiting for soup, for bread, for something to keep them from collapsing entirely. The soup kitchens were often run by charities or churches. Big metal pots steaming with whatever ingredients could be found. Beans, potatoes, sometimes a hint of meat if the cook was generous or forgetful. People would bring their own bowls, sometimes old tin cans or cups, and they'd shuffle through quietly. No one wanted to make eye contact. Pride was a luxury most couldn't afford. If you had a job, even a bad one, you clung to it. A man sweeping floors for 10 cents an hour felt lucky. 10 cents. You can't even buy a single paper napkin with that today. But in 1932, it meant you might bring home a loaf of bread, maybe even a bit of sugar, if you didn't mind skipping lunch. And if you lost your job, you might just start walking. People took to the road, drifting from town to town in search of work. Sometimes they'd hop freight trains, boxcars filled with other desperate travelers. They called them hobos, though most weren't the romantic wanderers you see in old movies. They were fathers, brothers, people who once had houses, now chasing rumors of work like tumbleweeds chasing wind. The hobo camps, sometimes called jungles, were rough. A few tents, maybe a fire pit, maybe a tin pot hanging over it. The smell of smoke and canned beans. If you were lucky, the local sheriff would let you stay a few nights before moving you along. If not, well, you learned to move fast the next time. Back home, families did what they could to hold things together. Women stretched every meal like a magician stretching a scarf. They made depression cake with no eggs, no milk, and no butter, because they had none of those things. And still, it somehow tasted sweet enough to remind people they were still human. Children grew up fast. They learned not to ask for things. They learned to patch their shoes with cardboard and pretend it worked. They learned to play with sticks instead of toys and to smile when their mothers looked tired. Because even as the adults broke down quietly, the children often tried to hold them up, small acts of hope disguised as ordinary moments. And still, through all that bleakness, there were strange bits of beauty. Music didn't stop. In fact, it became more important. The radio was like a candle in the dark, cheap entertainment that reached into every living room. Families gathered around not just for news, but for voices that made them feel less alone. There was swing music and laughter from comedians like Jack Benny. Even President Roosevelt came through that small box of wood and wires, speaking calmly to the nation. He called them fireside chats, as if he were sitting right there with you by the hearth. People clung to that voice. It made the chaos outside feel, if not manageable, at least momentarily distant. Let's drift over to one of those households now. Picture a small living room, a worn rug, a crackling radio glowing softly in the corner. A family of 5 sits around it. The father leans forward, elbows on his knees. The mother knits quietly, pretending not to worry about the rent. The children sit cross-legged, half asleep, listening to Roosevelt's warm, careful words. He talks about recovery, about unity, about hope. He doesn't promise miracles, just a kind of collective patience. And somehow, that's enough to get people through another night. But daily life wasn't all solemn. There were absurdities, too. People bartered for everything. You might trade a chicken for a haircut, or a sack of potatoes for a used coat. It was an economy held together with favors and apologies, and sometimes a good sense of humor, because humor didn't vanish. If anything, people got funnier, in a dry, resigned kind of way. Someone might say, "At least my wallet's lighter," after losing their job. Or, "I'd invest in stocks again if I could afford socks." Laughter became a small rebellion against despair. Let's not forget how differently people treated waste. In the 1930s, nothing was ever thrown away. Old flour sacks became dresses. Broken furniture became firewood. Glass jars were reused until the labels peeled off. Even soap scraps were melted down and pressed into new bars. Recycling wasn't trendy. It was survival. What's interesting is how resourceful people became. If you couldn't buy something, you figured out how to make it. If you couldn't make it, you learned how to do without. The Depression created an entire generation of people who saved every button, every string, every paper bag. And for the rest of their lives, they never quite stopped doing it. Even decades later, when they finally had money again, they'd still wash aluminum foil and reuse it, because deep down, they remembered what it was like to have nothing. Meanwhile, the government tried a bit of everything. Roosevelt's New Deal became a patchwork of programs. Some helped, some didn't. Some were just glorified experiments. They built dams, roads, schools, and parks. Men with shovels dug ditches for a few dollars a week. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dignity. And that was worth something. Imagine walking through one of those work camps. Rows of canvas tents. Men eating from tin plates. The air heavy with sweat and cigarette smoke. But there's also laughter, a sense of shared struggle. If you looked closely, you'd see that people hadn't entirely given up. Let's drift, just for a moment, into one of those evenings. The work is done. The sun is setting over the hills. Someone pulls out a harmonica. A few others hum along. The fire crackles softly, and for a moment, everything feels still. There's no money, no comfort, no certainty, but there is music, and that counts for a lot. Now, if you'd been alive then, what would you have done? Would you have left home to chase work across the country? Or stayed, trying to hold your family together? Tell me in the comments what kind of depression survivor you think you'd be. The traveler, the homemaker, or maybe the quiet dreamer with a radio by the window. Let's drift onward. Because the Great Depression wasn't just about poverty. It was about how people adapted, how they found ways to keep living when the world seemed determined to stop spinning. Let's settle back in. You can stay right where you are, warm, half drowsy, safe. Because we're going to linger a bit longer in that gray decade. The 1930s didn't rush anywhere, and neither should we. When people think of the Great Depression, they picture suffering. Breadlines, worn shoes, dusty farms. But daily life was also strange, inventive, and oddly stylish, in a way only desperation can be. It's funny how, when people have less, they often start caring more about appearances. Maybe it's a form of defiance. When everything else is collapsing, at least your collar can still be straight. By the mid-1930s, there was this quiet social competition. Everyone was broke, but still pretending not to be too broke. People patched their clothes so carefully that the mending itself became a fashion statement. If you owned one decent outfit, you wore it proudly everywhere. Church, job interviews, the occasional town dance. Same outfit, different optimism. Men greased their hair into neat shapes. Women pinned theirs up in soft waves copied from Hollywood stars. Hollywood, in fact, became everyone's shared dream. It was the one industry that didn't seem to get dusty. Movie tickets were about a dime, which sounds cheap now, but even then, a dime meant choosing between escape and eating. Still, many people chose escape, because let's be honest, watching Clark Gable look effortlessly confident was much more appealing than staring at a stack of unpaid bills. The movie theaters were an entire world of their own. Velvet seats, the smell of popcorn, the hum of the projector. You'd walk in from the street, blinking against the sudden darkness. And for a couple of hours, you could forget everything waiting outside. No dust, no soup lines, no landlord. Just perfect people saying perfect things under perfect lighting. The stars of the Depression weren't just entertainers. They were hope in human form. Jean Harlow, Greta Garbo, Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. They danced and laughed through a world that still had clean floors and sparkling champagne. And even if you knew it wasn't real, that didn't matter. Dreams don't need to be realistic to be effective. Radio shows carry that same kind of magic. But straight into the living room, families would sit around, everyone staring at the radio as if it were a glowing fireplace of voices. There were comedy programs, dramas, and mysteries, simple but strangely captivating. A hero might face a villain, or a detective might solve an impossible case, all within 30 minutes. And for that half hour, you didn't have to think about the grocery bill. It was a cheap kind of therapy. Children loved the radio even more. Saturday morning serials told endless stories about cowboys, space adventurers, or heroic detectives. Kids would huddle close, eyes wide, hanging on every word. It didn't matter that the sound effects were just someone shaking tin foil or tapping coconuts together. The imagination filled in the rest. Outside of entertainment, though, the real world remained uninspired. Money was tight, food was repetitive, and people got creative in their boredom. Card games became national hobbies. Bridge, gin rummy, poker, played not for money but for bragging rights. People hosted potluck dinners, where everyone brought whatever scraps they could spare. Sometimes that meant 3 casseroles and a single pie. Other times it was just a dozen loaves of slightly different bread. Neighbors became lifelines. There was a quiet culture of sharing. Someone might lend you flour this week, knowing you'd lend them sugar next time. And even if you couldn't repay in kind, you'd repay in kindness. Help watching the children, a ride into town, a mended coat. It wasn't charity, it was survival by community. In rural towns, The general store was still the social center. You'd stop by to buy, or more often to just browse, which really meant gossip. People leaned on the counter, talking about who got work, who lost it, whose cow had finally given up. News traveled slowly but thoroughly. You didn't need Twitter when you had Mrs. Peterson's sharp memory and complete lack of filter. Even in small joys, though, the Depression showed its fingerprints. Toys, for example, were simple. Wooden blocks, handmade dolls, a tin car if you were lucky. Sometimes children made their own toys, stuffing rags into old socks or carving figures from bits of wood. Playtime wasn't about abundance, but imagination. And in hindsight, those children probably grew up more inventive than any modern kid with an iPad. Food was a topic of constant creativity. You've heard of depression cake, but there was also mock apple pie, made from crackers instead of apples, because apples cost too much and crackers didn't. The crust hid the illusion nicely. And when you close your eyes, maybe it tasted close enough. Casseroles became the culinary mascot of the decade, because casseroles could disguise anything. Leftover potatoes, canned corn, bits of onion mystery meat. Bake it all together, sprinkle some crumbs on top, and you had dinner. At least, that's what you told the children. Of course, not everyone suffered equally. The wealthy still existed. But even they started practicing visible frugality, a sort of fashionable modesty. They wore simpler clothes, ate plainer meals. Not necessarily out of empathy, just out of optics. Nothing says relatable like pretending your butler is just a family friend who happens to iron everything you own. Meanwhile, small luxuries gained new importance. A bar of soap that smelled nice, a fresh haircut, a clean pair of socks. Things that reminded people that civilization hadn't completely dissolved. The Depression also reshaped gender roles in its own quiet way. Many men lost their jobs, and for some, that shattered their sense of identity. The breadwinner, image cracked under the pressure of empty pockets. Women, on the other hand, became the quiet engines of survival. They cooked, mended, budgeted, and worked odd jobs. Some became seamstresses, some took in laundry, some bartered with neighbors. It wasn't glamorous, but they held families together. If you listen to old interviews, you'll notice something striking. Women often say they just did what had to be done. There's no drama, no self-praise, just a calm acceptance, and maybe a hint of pride. We sometimes romanticize the 1930s homemaker, the floral apron, the soft smile, the spotless kitchen. But in reality, she was exhausted. Every meal required mental math. Every chore was doubled by scarcity. And every night, she went to bed wondering how to make tomorrow work again. Men, meanwhile, struggled with the loss of purpose. Unemployment wasn't just financial, it was emotional. Newspapers wrote about the defeated look, men sitting silently on porches, staring at nothing. And when they did find temporary work, it was often brutal. Lifting, digging, carrying, shoveling. Anything that exchanged sweat for a few dollars. Still, there was quiet dignity in that. Because even a day of hard labor meant you'd done something. It meant you could bring home a few coins. It meant you still mattered. Children noticed everything. They learned early how fragile adulthood really was. They saw their parents whispering over bills. They noticed the strain in their fatter shoulders. And yet, they also noticed the small moments of joy. A family dinner, a joke, a borrowed toy. They learned to find comfort in very small things. Let's drift, just for a moment, into one of those family scenes. A small kitchen, the wallpaper yellowed, the stove humming weakly. The father is repairing a broken chair. The mother is mixing flour and water, humming under her breath. A child sits at the table, drawing on brown paper with a stub of pencil. Outside, the wind moves through the trees. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, this moment is its own kind of triumph. Life continues, quietly, stubbornly. Entertainment became the sole survival instinct. Even sports became emotional lifelines. Baseball teams gave people something to cheer for, even when everything else went wrong. Babe Ruth still swung for the fences. and fans still crowded bleachers, pretending the price of a ticket wasn't half a day's wage. For a few hours, it was summer again, and things were fine. And then, of course, there was radio comedy. Simple, predictable, sometimes corny, but deeply comforting. Programs like Amos and Andy and The Jack Benny Show filled living rooms with laughter. People quoted the jokes to each other the next day, as if to prove they were still part of something larger than their own worries. Ironically, the Great Depression created a generation with low expectations but deep appreciation. They didn't expect luxury. They expected endurance. They didn't chase happiness. They cherished stability. And maybe, in some twisted way, that made them emotionally stronger than most of us today. Let's pause on that thought for a second. If you were living in those years when money meant survival and hope came through static on a radio, what would you cling to? Would it be laughter, faith, or just the small comfort of knowing tomorrow hadn't arrived yet? Tell me in the comments what little ritual you think you'd hold on to. Because even in hard times, humans always find rituals. A bedtime story, a cup of tea, a prayer, a song. These are the quiet anchors that keep us from drifting too far away. Let's drift a little further into the decade now. The worst of the Great Depression is beginning to loosen its grip. Not vanish, just loosen. Like a too-tight collar finally unbuttoned after dinner. It's the mid-1930s. The air still tastes faintly of dust and worry, but there's a new hum underneath it. A kind of cautious optimism. People are tired of despair. It's gone out of fashion. The government's New Deal programs have started reshaping the landscape. Roads are being paved, bridges built, murals painted on post office walls. For the first time in years, men are leaving home each morning with purpose. They still earn little, but they're earning, and that makes all the difference. Picture the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, young men in khaki uniforms working in the wilderness, digging trails, planting trees, building cabins in state parks. They look like soldiers, but they're armed with shovels. They earn $30 a month. 25 of those dollars get sent straight home to their families, which means $5 to live on and the quiet dignity of being useful. For many, those camps are the first steady meals they've had in years. Beans, bread, and coffee taste like luxury when someone else is paying for them. At night, the men sit around campfires. They smoke, they sing, they write letters to mothers they'll never admit they miss. It's not paradise, but it's structure, and structure feels a lot like hope. Back in towns and cities, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, puts artists, writers, and teachers to work. It's an odd idea, paying people to be creative in the middle of economic ruin. But somehow it works. Painters decorate public buildings with scenes of ordinary life. Farmers, factory workers, children playing in the sun. The art isn't subtle. It's propaganda for perseverance. But it's warm and colorful in a world that's been gray for too long. Writers are hired to document local histories. You could walk into a small WPA office and find someone interviewing old farmers about life before electricity. Because apparently, the best way to fix the economy was to remember what life was like before we broke it. Teachers, librarians, actors, they all find a strange new purpose in government paychecks. Imagine that, being hired to make people a little less miserable. It's not glamorous, but it might be the noblest job description in history. Of course, not everyone is impressed. Some critics call it socialism, others call it wasteful, and some just call it confusing. But the truth is, most people are too busy trying to survive to care about labels. Let's drift to the streets of New York now. It's 1936. The skyscrapers that once symbolized Roaring Twenties optimism now stand like ancient monuments to ambition. But the city has found its rhythm again. Streetcars clatter, vendors shout, radios spill swing music into the sidewalks. There's motion again, slow, uneven but forward. People are buying things. Tiny things, new shoes, a hat, maybe even an ice cream cone on Sunday. And every purchase feels like a small victory over the last 6 years of nothing. Dance halls reopen. Couples sway to Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington. Jazz becomes a language of recovery. Smooth, confident, improvisational. It's what hope sounds like when it's still a little nervous. Somewhere in a smoky club, a young woman taps her foot under the table. She doesn't have much money, but she saved enough for one night out. The band is good, her dress is secondhand, and she feels almost glamorous. She'll tell herself she's not really dancing, just standing close to the rhythm. But really, she's remembering what joy feels like. The late 1930s also bring a subtle shift in how people see the future. They've been humbled, but they're wiser. They don't trust markets or promises anymore, but they trust each other a little more than before. Neighbors still share food and tools. Families still live under one roof. The Depression taught people to depend on one another in ways they've forgotten were possible. Of course, there's still irony everywhere. New Deal posters preach optimism, while bank signs quietly warn about insolvency. Politicians argue about prosperity while wearing suits so shiny they could be used as mirrors. And Roosevelt keeps giving radio speeches, calm as ever, as if reassuring a particularly anxious nation of toddlers. You have to admire his tone, though he never sounded panicked. Even when everything was falling apart, that was a secret. He made crisis sound almost polite. While America crawls toward recovery, the rest of the world starts making nervous noises. In Europe, things are stirring. Germany, for instance, has decided that peace is overrated. And Italy's experimenting with dictatorship as if it were the latest gadget. But we're not quite there yet. In the mid-30s, Americans mostly pretend foreign problems don't exist. Isolationism isn't just policy. It's emotional self-care. People have had enough drama at home. Let's drift back to small-town America for a while. Because the 1930s weren't just economic, they were cultural. Community life became a kind of homemade glue. Church socials, barn dances, local fairs, they all made a quiet comeback. Because when you can't buy happiness, you tend to start scheduling it. The local movie theater, often called a picture house, remains the town's pulse. For a few cents, you could watch newsreels before the main film. That's how people learned about the outside world. They saw Roosevelt smiling, Hitler shouting, and Amelia Earhart flying over oceans. It was history in short bursts, sandwiched between cartoons and melodramas. Children loved the newsreels for the music and explosions. Adults watched for reassurance that life was still happening somewhere else. It was oddly comforting to know that chaos existed beyond your own backyard. Back at home, radios became more sophisticated. Families upgraded from boxy tabletop models to beautiful floor consoles. Tall, polished wood, glowing dials, the faint hum of electricity. It was almost furniture with a heartbeat. Some people even named their radios. That's how intimate the relationship became. Evenings revolved around those broadcasts. Dinner, then dishes, then the family settling into their favorite spots. The father in his chair, the mother with her mending, the children sprawled on the rug. Static fades, an orchestra swells, and a familiar announcer begins to speak. It's like the start of a collective dream. The ads were unironically wholesome. Toothpaste that would make you smile like a movie star. Soap that would save your marriage. Coffee that was approved by mothers everywhere. It was propaganda, sure, but gentle propaganda. The kind that made people feel seen instead of scolded. Daily routines grew predictable again, which, after years of chaos, felt revolutionary. Breakfast, work, dinner, radio, bed. Repeat. No one called it exciting, but they called it living, and that was enough. Now, let's drift over to the farms again. By the late 1930s, the Dust Bowl had finally begun to ease. Rain returned, timidly at first. Grass started to hold the soil again, and farmers cautiously returned to the fields. They'd learned the hard way about overplowing and overconfidence. The government even hired scientists to teach soil conservation, a phrase that sounded very boring, but saved entire counties. Farmers planted trees as windbreaks, rotated crops, and treated the ground like a fragile friend rather than an endless resource. It was humble wisdom, earned the difficult way. Migrants who'd fled west during the worst dust storms found themselves in California, picking fruit in the valleys. They were called Okies, regardless of where they'd actually come from. They lived in makeshift camps, rows of tents and shacks. It wasn't the promised land, but at least it wasn't Kansas anymore. John Steinbeck noticed them. He wrote The Grapes of Wrath, which somehow made the suffering poetic. The book scandalized the rich and comforted the poor, which means it probably did its job perfectly. Through all of this, Americans developed a sort of national personality, stoic, sarcastic, quietly brave. You can still see traces of it in their children and grandchildren. That patient thriftiness, that refusal to waste anything, that suspicious glance at anyone who calls themselves a visionary. Even fashion, which seems trivial, tells a story. Hemlines dropped, shoulders broadened, fabrics simplified. Clothes were practical but dignified. People looked neat even when their wallets weren't, because the one thing they could still control was how they carried themselves. And then there's a small miracle of how people kept finding ways to celebrate. Weddings still happened, though rings were cheaper and cakes smaller. Birthdays were marked with handmade gifts. Christmas trees were decorated with popcorn strings and newspaper stars. Holidays became less about gifts and more about company. The Depression turned togetherness into a survival strategy. As the decade nears its end, something curious begins to happen. Factories start hiring again. Cars begin rolling off assembly lines. The hum of industry returns, hesitant, like a person relearning how to walk. The economy is healing, but so is the collective mood. There's a sense that maybe, just maybe, the worst is behind them. Of course, they have no idea what's coming next. No one in 1939 imagines that within 2 years, the whole world will be at war again. But for now, there's hope, and maybe that's enough to rest on tonight. So, if you had lived in that moment, after years of struggle, finally glimpsing stability, what would you have felt? Relief? Suspicion? Would you dare to trust the calm after such a long storm? Tell me in the comments what kind of person you think you'd be at the end of the 1930s. The cautious optimist, or the one still counting every penny just in case. Let's drift onward next time, into the years when recovery met rearmament, when the Depression quietly faded, not because it healed itself, but because the world had found a new, louder disaster to focus on. Hey everyone, welcome back. Or if you've somehow stumbled into this halfway through, welcome to our slow drift through the dustier corners of the 1930s. The lights are low, the air feels still, and we're floating through another quiet chapter of what it meant to live, and sometimes barely survive, during the Great Depression. Tonight, we'll linger with the ordinary people. Not the presidents or tycoons, but the ones who lined up for soup, patched old shoes, and found ways to hold on to some kind of dignity, even when the world seemed to forget what that word meant. So, take a breath, settle in, and let's ease back into it. It's easy to picture Great Depression as all black and white. Men in flat caps, women with aprons, and everyone looking perpetually tired. That image isn't far from the truth. Breadlines became a defining symbol. Those endless rows of people waiting quietly in the cold for a ladle of watery soup or a crust of bread. There wasn't much conversation in those lines. Just the sound of footsteps shuffling forward, and the quiet coughs of people who hadn't been warm or full in a long time. No one wanted to be there, but at some point, almost everyone was. Men who once worked in offices or owned shops found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder with factory workers and day laborers. Some wore threadbare suits, ties knotted carefully as if that might convince someone they were still respectable. They weren't trying to fool anyone, really. They were just trying to fool themselves. Because hunger, like unemployment, had a way of leveling people. The soup kitchen didn't care about your resume. Run mostly by churches, charities, and occasionally well-meaning local committees, these kitchens became tiny hubs of life. Inside, there was a clatter of tin plates, the steam of weak broth, and the smell of overcooked vegetables, a smell people would remember for decades. Volunteers moved with quiet efficiency, sometimes too tired to smile, sometimes trying too hard to. And outside, the line just kept forming. For many people, there was shame in those lines. They'd grown up believing that needing help meant failing somehow. America, after all, had spent the 1920s bragging about its endless potential. So when everything collapsed, people didn't just lose money. They lost the illusion of control. Some stood in line with their collars turned up and hats low, hoping they wouldn't be recognized. Others made uneasy jokes to break the silence. "At least the soup's hot," they'd mutter, even when it wasn't. Families improvised. Women stretched a dollar until it squeaked. They boiled bones twice for soup, saved bacon grease to fry potatoes, and patched clothes with fabric from flour sacks. In fact, flour companies started printing cheerful patterns on their sacks because they knew people were using them for dresses and curtains. There's something heartbreakingly practical about that, turning necessity into something almost beautiful. Children, of course, saw things differently. They didn't always grasp the scale of it, just that their parents seemed more tired, or that dinner portions had quietly shrunk. Many kids shared one pair of shoes between siblings, or went barefoot to school when it was warm enough. Lunch boxes were sometimes empty, sometimes carried just for show, but they played anyway, using sticks for bats, bottle caps for coins, anything for distraction. It's strange how play persists even when everything else falls apart. Farmers, too, face their own kind of quiet ruin. Prices for crops dropped so low that it sometimes cost more to harvest them than to leave them in the ground. There were stories of farmers dumping milk into ditches or burning corn for fuel, because at least it gave some warmth. It wasn't that they wanted to waste food, they just couldn't afford to sell it. It's one of those historical moments that makes you blink. People going hungry, while others destroy food because the economy said it wasn't worth anything. A perfect example of human absurdity. In cities, the unemployed made their own rough shelters, the infamous Hoovervilles. Collections of shacks, built from scraps of tin, wood, and cardboard, sprawled in abandoned lots and parks. Some even had makeshift street names and mayors. Small attempt at order in chaos. They called them Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, a name that was both bitter and joking. The humor was dark, but it helped, because sometimes laughing at the system was the only power people had left. The residents of these places lived in a kind of fragile community. They shared what little they had, traded favors, and looked out for one another. Someone might keep a small fire burning for warmth. Someone else might scavenge for food scraps. A few tried to plant small gardens, though the soil was usually too poor. At night, the wind rattled the tin walls and fires flickered through the cracks, giving everything a faint, ghostly glow. For many men, the loss of work meant the loss of identity. They'd grown up in a culture that measured worth by productivity. So when the jobs vanished, so did their sense of self. Some left home to ride the rails, hopping freight trains in search of work anywhere it could be found. It was dangerous and lonely, but it gave them movement, a sense of doing something. These men became known as hobos, though not all of them were wanderers by choice. They left behind families who waited for letters that might never come. Train yards became strange little crossroads of America. You could find ex-miners, ex-lawyers, young boys, and old soldiers all sleeping on the same boxcar, sharing stories or silence. There was even a kind of hobo code, symbols carved or chalked near houses and fences, marking which homes might offer food, which were dangerous and which should be avoided. It was a secret language of survival, quietly passed along the tracks. Back in the towns, women often took on whatever odd work they could find, washing clothes, taking in sewing, or renting out rooms. Some sold homemade pies or soap door to door. It was exhausting, but it was something. They became the glue that held families together, even as men drifted into silence or self-blame. And somehow, in that relentless practicality, there was strength, not heroic or grand, just quietly enduring. Community life didn't disappear, but it changed. Churches were full, not always out of faith, but because they offered warmth and structure. Schools tried to keep going with whatever supplies they could scrape together. Teachers sometimes brought in their own food for hungry students. There were dances, too, small, dimly lit gatherings where people could listen to a band and pretend, for a few hours, that things were normal again. Maybe that's why music from that era feels both wistful and brave. Radio also became a lifeline. For a few minutes each evening, families gathered around the crackling speakers to listen to Roosevelt's calm, conversational voice, his famous fireside chats. He didn't fix everything with words, but he gave people something they'd lost, the feeling that someone was listening. And that mattered. You can't eat optimism, but sometimes it helps you last another day. And then there was humor. Dry, absurd, defiant humor. People joked about Hoover steaks, fried onions, or boiled weeds, Hoover blankets, newspapers used as covers, and Hoover wagons, cars pulled by mules after the gas ran out. It was bitter, yes, but also human. Making fun of hardship doesn't erase it, but it softens its edges. There's something strangely poetic about how people kept trying to live well, even when life wasn't. Someone would sweep the dirt floor of a Hooverville shack or polish a pair of cracked shoes. A man would still tip his hat to a woman on the street, even if both were broke. Dignity became a quiet rebellion. And somehow, amid the bleakness, people fell in love, got married, and even had children. Babies were born in shacks and tiny apartments, in hospitals and farmhouses, in a country that had almost forgotten how to smile, and yet still did. Hope, inconvenient as ever, refused to die. As we drift toward the next part, think about that. How people can endure almost anything, not through grand gestures, but through small, persistent acts of normalcy. Keeping a garden, ironing a shirt, laughing at a bad joke. What do you think you would have done then? Would you have stood in that breadline, head high, or tried to disappear into the crowd? Tell me down in the comments. And as always, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade away, and we'll drift onward together into the next quiet corner of history. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. The lights are low again, and the world feels just a little slower. Tonight, we're floating farther west, out of the cities, away from the breadlines, and into the fields where the wind never seemed to stop blowing. The Great Depression had already stolen jobs, homes, and dignity from millions. But in the middle of America, the land itself decided to join in. It became a place of dust, of silence, and of an entire generation quietly choking on its own soil. We're drifting now into the Dust Bowl. You've probably seen the photos. Those endless plains under a sky the color of old smoke, families with handkerchiefs pressed over their faces, trying to keep the earth out of their lungs. But living there wasn't just an image in sepia tones. It was sound and smell and constant abrasive dust. You couldn't escape it. It seeped into beds, into soup, into the folds of your clothes. It scratched your eyes when you blinked. It was a kind of invasion, slow, relentless, and intimate. The Dust Bowl didn't appear overnight. It was a result of decades of optimism, over farming, and a few terribly unlucky years of drought. The Great Plains had once been grasslands, held together by deep-rooted prairie grass that could withstand just about anything. But farmers had torn much of it out, eager for profit during the boom years. The soil, now bare and fragile, had nothing left to cling to when the winds came. And the winds came often. At first, people thought it was just a bad year, then a bad few years. By the time the 1930s hit full stride, the sky itself seemed to be rebelling. There were black blizzards. Storms so dense with dust that day turned to night. Livestock suffocated in fields. Chickens choked to death in their coops. Cars stalled because their engines filled with grit. People stuffed wet rags under doors and hung damp sheets over windows. But the dust still found its way in, coating everything in a fine brown film. You could write your name on a table 5 minutes after wiping it. Children developed what they called dust pneumonia. Doctors saw lungs lined with silt, like sandpaper. Mothers watched helplessly as their babies coughed in their sleep. People tried wearing wet masks, bandanas, even flour sacks over their faces, but it didn't help much. When the storms hit, families would gather in the center of their homes under quilts and just wait, listening to the sound of dust battering the walls like rain that didn't stop. And yet, for some reason, many stayed. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was just the cruel arithmetic of poverty. When you have nowhere else to go, you stay put. They told themselves it would rain again soon. They said things like, next spring will be better. Hope became a kind of ritual, repeated so often it lost its meaning, but still had to be said. Those who did leave joined the growing migration westward toward California. Newspapers called them Okies, a name that started as an insult but eventually became almost a badge of identity. The Okies came from Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Arkansas, packing whatever they could onto rickety cars and heading west on Route 66, the so-called Mother Road. Their cars were piled high with furniture, mattresses, pots, and hope that wasn't entirely reasonable. The journey was brutal. Roads were long, gas was expensive, and breakdowns were constant. Entire families camped by the roadside, cooking what little they had over small fires. The children were sunburned, the parents exhausted, and the cars often ran more on prayer than on fuel. When they reached California, they discovered something painful. Everyone else had the same idea. The promised land of fruit and work was already overflowing with desperate people. Migrant camps sprang up in orchards and fields, rows of makeshift tents and lean-tos. Conditions were filthy, pay was low, and the locals weren't exactly welcoming. Californians feared the flood of poor migrants, and newspapers stirred up resentment. Signs appeared saying, "Okie's not welcome." But the workers stayed. They picked crops for pennies, slept on dirt floors, and lined up for handouts when they could find them. They weren't lazy, as some accused. They just couldn't get ahead. There were too many hands and too few jobs. The lucky ones might find steady work on a big farm, where they lived in shacks and worked long hours under sun that didn't seem to care. Still, even in those miserable camps, there were traces of humanity. Someone would strum a guitar in the evenings. Kids would chase each other through the dust, laughing anyway. A woman might trade her last bit of sugar for a handful of flour to bake biscuits that didn't rise but smelled like home. You could almost forget for a moment how fragile it all was. Government aid eventually trickled in. The Farm Security Administration set up better camps, with sanitation and water pumps. They even sent photographers, people like Dorothea Lange, whose photos captured the weary, proud faces of migrants and turned them into icons of endurance. The most famous is Migrant Mother, Florence Owens Thompson, staring off into the distance with her children leaning on her. You can almost feel her exhaustion through the image, the weight of every choice she didn't have. Meanwhile, those who stayed on the land back in the plains tried to adapt. Some learned new farming methods, planting rows to break the wind, rotating crops, and leaving parts of the field fallow. Others just waited for the government to buy their ruined farms and move them out. By the mid-1930s, agencies like the Soil Conservation Service started trying to undo the damage, but it was slow work. Nature takes her time, especially when she's been insulted. And through it all, there was music. Folk songs began to tell the story of the dust. Woody Guthrie, an Oklahoma native, wrote songs that were half lament, half rebellion. "So long. It's been good to know ya," he'd sing with a wry, tired smile. His songs weren't just entertainment. They were the voice of people who'd lost everything but still had stories to tell. Dust even shaped memory. People from that era would later talk about how silence made them uneasy. They were so used to the sound of wind that a still day felt wrong. Some said they could never quite shake the habit of dusting. Decades later, they wiped tables obsessively, as if the storm might come back. Trauma lingers quietly like that. But perhaps the strangest thing was how people kept finding reasons to hope. They planted gardens again, even when the soil looked dead. They built fences that promptly blew over. They hung curtains in houses that leaked. They knew it probably wouldn't help much, but it felt better to try than to surrender. By the end of the 1930s, rain finally came back to the plains cautiously, as if testing whether it was safe to return. Crops grew again, though the scars in the land and in the people didn't heal so quickly. Many who'd left never went back. They became part of the migrant story, the invisible backbone of cheap labor that built post-war America. Others returned, replanting wheat where dust had once blown freely, pretending it had all been a bad dream. The Dust Bowl, in its quiet cruelty, taught a strange lesson, that even when everything collapses, economy, nature, certainty, people still cling to habit, to hope, to the stubborn act of existing. Imagine standing there, in the middle of that endless horizon, watching the sky turn black again. Would you have stayed, or would you have packed everything into a car and driven west toward a promise that probably wasn't real? Tell me what you think down in the comments. Let's drift on, then, leaving behind the dust and the dry wind, and follow those restless travelers into the cities once more, where something new, strange, and almost hopeful was beginning to stir. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another quiet stretch of our long, sleepy walk through the Great Depression. You probably noticed by now, this isn't really a story of disaster. It's more like a long sigh, a slow unfolding of what happens when the world gets tired and has to start over. Tonight, we're drifting gently into the 1930s again, but this time, something faintly hopeful is on the air. Not exactly joy, just motion, a sense that maybe, just maybe, life would work again, even if no one was quite sure how. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was running on fumes. Banks had failed, farms were dust, and faith in government was about as low as a country can sink without just giving up entirely. Roosevelt, or FDR as he liked to be called, arrived with a wide smile and a cigarette holder tilted upward like an exclamation point. He had charm, which was something, and confidence, which was rarer. And that was enough for people to lean in, to listen. His voice came through radios across the country. Calm, warm, just slightly patrician. In his fireside chats, he'd explain complicated things as if he were sitting across from you at the kitchen table. He'd talk about banks and recovery and patience, and somehow people believe him. It wasn't magic. It was tone. When someone sounds sure, it makes you feel a little less uncertain yourself. And so began what he called a New Deal, a sprawling experiment in rebuilding the economy by sheer force of imagination and bureaucracy. Some of it worked. Some of it didn't. But what mattered most, at least at first, was that something was being done. After years of drift, the country finally had momentum again, even if it didn't always know where it was going. The New Deal created jobs because people didn't need speeches. They needed paychecks. There was a Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, which sent young men into forests and mountains to plant trees, build trails, and stop erosion. They earned about $30 a month, and most sent home $25 of it to their families. They lived in camps, wore uniforms, and got 3 meals a day. For many, it was the first time they'd ever had such security, even if it came with blisters. You can almost picture them, lines of skinny young men with shovels, laughing in the woods, whistling badly as they worked. They planted over 3 billion trees in less than a decade. That's not a typo. 3 billion. The CCC didn't just rebuild the land. It gave people a reason to get up in the morning. Then there was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, a kind of national to-do list for everything that needed fixing or building. Bridges, roads, schools, post offices, parks, murals. If it stood still long enough, someone under the WPA probably painted, paved, or documented it. At its peak, the program employed millions of people. The WPA even hired artists, writers, and musicians. It was a small miracle in itself. The government paying people to make art in the middle of a depression. The Federal Art Project put painters to work decorating public buildings with bold, idealistic murals. Scenes of workers, farmers, and everyday life. The Federal Writers Project sent out authors to record local histories and folk tales, gathering stories that would have been lost otherwise. And then there was the Federal Music Project, which sent orchestras on tour across the country. For a few cents, you could sit in a dusty town hall and listen to Beethoven played live. It was a strange time, one where a mason might be building a bridge while a poet was being paid to describe it. The idea was simple but radical, that beauty and culture mattered, even when you were broke, maybe especially then. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Business leaders accused Roosevelt of socialism, and conservatives complained that the New Deal was wasting money. Others argued it wasn't doing enough. Roosevelt smiled through it all, cigarette holder as Johnny Angle, and just kept pushing forward. Try something, he said once. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. It's a good motto, one that works for countries and for people, too. Meanwhile, ordinary life was slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting. The banks reopened, jobs trickled back, and a constant background panic began to fade. There were still breadlines and bankruptcies, of course. The Depression didn't vanish overnight. But for the first time in years, people began to plan for the future again, even if that just meant buying a new pair of shoes or fixing a leaky roof. Farmers got help through programs that paid them to leave some fields unplanted, which raised prices and let the soil recover. It felt odd, being paid not to grow food. But for many, it was a difference between losing everything and holding on. Rural areas also got electricity for the first time through the Rural Electrification Administration. Imagine being a farmer in the 1930s, and one evening, after years of darkness, the light switch finally works. It must have felt like sorcery. The New Deal didn't just build things. It changed how people saw government. For the first time, many Americans began to think of the federal government as something that could actually help them, not just tax them. It was an uneasy shift, but a lasting one. And beyond the policies, there was something quieter happening. The slow rebuilding of trust. Trust that a job could last. That a dollar might still mean something tomorrow. That the ground, however dusty or uneven, wouldn't give way again beneath your feet. There were lighter moments. 2. People found ways to laugh again. Hollywood, ever practical, made sure of that. The 1930s were the golden age of screwball comedies, light, fast, witty films that existed mainly to make you forget the world outside the theater. People adored actors like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, watching rich people fall in love and get into ridiculous arguments. It was fantasy, pure and simple, and for a few hours, that was enough. At home, radios played crooners like Bing Crosby, whose smooth voice sounded like comfort itself. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Became an unofficial anthem of depression, wistful and quietly defiant. In a way, the songs of the era captured what everyone was feeling, a strange mixture of longing, sadness, and stubborn optimism. By the late 1930s, the economy had begun to lift, unevenly, hesitantly, like a man recovering from a long illness. There were setbacks like the Roosevelt recession of 1937, when the government cut spending too soon and things dipped again. But the overall trend was upward. Life wasn't easy, but it was possible again. And beneath all that, you could feel a subtle change in identity. America had learned something from being broken. Not humility, exactly. That's never been a national specialty. But empathy. People had seen hunger up close. They'd lost things and learned to share what little was left. They'd realized, perhaps for the first time, that prosperity wasn't guaranteed. Roosevelt once said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, but whether we provide enough for those who have little." It sounded nice then. It still does now. And maybe that's because, beneath all the policy and paperwork, the New Deal was about something deeper, the idea that societies, like people, can start over. Let's drift on a bit longer through this fragile recovery. Imagine yourself there, the radio humming softly in the corner, the smell of dinner cooking again, maybe for the first time in a long while. You've still got debts, still got worries, but there's laughter somewhere in the neighborhood. Maybe you believe, just for an evening, that the worst had passed. What about you? Do you think you have joined one of those New Deal programs? Planting trees, building roads, painting murals, or would you stay behind, trying to make ends meet on your own? Tell me in the comments, if you'd like. For now, take a slow breath, and let's drift onward to the next part of our quiet journey, where the depression's lingering chill meets a new kind of fire on the horizon. Something no one expected. Something the whole world would soon feel. Hey, everyone, let's drift back again, just a little further into the night. By the time the 1930s finally limped toward their end, people had begun to notice something strange. The breadlines were shorter. The factory lights flickered back on. There were help-wanted signs in the windows again, though what exactly the help was wanted for wasn't always clear. It wasn't because the depression had been solved by some brilliant policy or miracle invention. It was because the world was, rather unfortunately, preparing for war. And war, in its strange, tragic way, is very good at keeping people busy. Factories that had once produced washing machines began quietly retooling to make aircraft parts. Farmers who had gone nearly bankrupt were suddenly urged to grow more food. Governments who had spent years urging thrift were now practically begging people to spend, as long as it was on the right things. And the newspapers, once full of bank failures and unemployment figures, were now filled with names of faraway places: Poland, Munich, Paris. places that sounded both exotic and grim. For Americans, the shift was almost disorienting. One moment, people were standing in soup lines. The next, they were being offered steady wages to rivet steel plates onto ships or assemble tanks. The Great Depression didn't exactly end. It transformed. The fear of hunger was replaced by the fear of headlines. But for many, that felt like progress. In 1939, as war officially broke out in Europe, the United States was still sitting on the sidelines, publicly neutral but privately preparing. President Roosevelt, ever the careful chess player, began lending aid to Britain, food, supplies, and eventually ships. Factories that had gone silent a decade earlier were roaring back to life, this time under new contracts stamped with reassuring words for defense purposes. It sounded patriotic. It was also, for many, a paycheck. Men who had spent years unemployed were suddenly indispensable again, and women who had been told their place was in the home found themselves asked politely, and then not so politely, to fill the gaps. It was a new kind of mobilization, one that felt like national therapy. After a decade of helplessness, everyone had something to do. Of course, it came with a kind of moral confusion. Everyone knew what war meant, but after 10 years of boredom, of uncertainty, of staring at empty plates, even war began to sound like a grim kind of order. There was, for once, a purpose. People worked long shifts, 7 days a week, and they complained less than you might expect, because for the first time in a while, the work actually mattered. In small towns, you could hear the change. The clatter of typewriters in draft offices, the clang of metal in reopened mills, the quiet hum of radios at night, announcing distant battles to families who'd never left their county. People pinned maps to their walls, tracking lines and arrows across Europe. Housewives became experts in geography. Children played games about tanks and submarines. And ration books became as familiar as cookbooks. Sugar, meat, gasoline, everything was counted, stamped, and measured. It was a system designed to be fair. But of course, human creativity intervened. There were small black markets, quiet deals with neighbors, whispered trades of coffee for butter. Housewives learned new recipes. Pies without sugar, stews without meat, desserts that were more optimistic than delicious. And yet, even the scarcity felt different. It wasn't the bitter scarcity of the Depression. It was a shared scarcity, one wrapped in patriotism. Everyone was giving something up for the boys overseas. That phrase alone could silence almost any complaint. People who had once resented government interference now wore rationing as a badge of honor. There was dignity in deprivation, a sense that this time the sacrifice had a purpose. Women, in particular, found themselves at the center of this new rhythm. When the men left for war, someone had to fill the machines, the offices, the classrooms, and even the farms. And so they did. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was millions of real women who found themselves doing work no one had ever thought offered them before. Welding, engineering, testing weapons. Jobs that had been strictly male domains just a few years earlier. It wasn't glamorous. It was loud, exhausting, and often dangerous. But it paid and it gave meaning. The Depression had taught people how to endure boredom. Now, the war taught them how to endure effort. Some of the same women who had once waited in breadlines now stood on assembly lines, their hair tied up in scarves, their hands blackened by oil. When their shifts ended, they went home to care for children, to write letters, to wait for telegrams that everyone dreaded. The mailman became a figure of both hope and terror. Every letter from abroad was opened with trembling fingers. The envelope smelled faintly of salt and dust. They carried little pieces of other worlds. Sand from North Africa, hints of snow from France. And the handwriting often changed, growing shakier as the months went by. Families saved those letters, sometimes sleeping with them under pillows. In towns across America, small things took on symbolic weight. A gold star in the window meant someone's son wasn't coming home. A blue one meant they were still alive, somewhere far away. People would glance at windows as they walked down the street, silently counting. It was a grim arithmetic, but it kept everyone connected. Back home, children played war with sticks and cardboard helmets. They practiced blackouts, turning off lights and drawing curtains when the sirens went off. Most of the country would never be bombed, but the drills gave a sense of solidarity with those who were. The darkness was eerie, whole neighborhoods swallowed by night. But some found it strangely peaceful, too. The world was quiet, just the sound of wind and the occasional dog barking in the distance. If you lived near a coast, you learned to live with uncertainty. Submarines sometimes lurked offshore, and rumor always traveled faster than truth. There were sightings of enemy ships, of saboteurs, of parachutes that turned out to be weather balloons. But mostly, life went on, carefully, dutifully, quietly. Factories never slept. There were night shifts now, entire cities glowing faintly even under blackout curtains. The hum of production became its own lullaby. Somewhere out there, people were fighting. Somewhere else, others were building the tools they'd need. It was a vast, synchronized effort that made even ordinary citizens feel like gears in a great, tragic machine. And then came the turning points. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, the long slog toward Berlin and Tokyo. Each one sent ripples through the home front. After Pearl Harbor, enlistment lines wrapped around city blocks. People who had once grumbled about government overreach now begged to join it. The Depression's quiet despair was replaced by a storm of determination. Every victory brought cheers. Every loss brought silence. The war effort blurred the lines between patriotism and survival. People saved every scrap of metal, every inch of rubber. Even cooking fat was collected, supposedly to make explosives. It was strange, but no one questioned it much. After years of being told to waste nothing, it was easy enough to believe that even bacon grease could win a war. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, the change was almost surreal. Factories reached full capacity, unemployment hit record lows, and wages climbed higher than they had been in decades. The Great Depression was quite literally over, and yet few celebrated. The price had been too high. Cities in Europe lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Soldiers came home older than their years, their faces tired, their eyes distant. The victory parade were loud, but the nights were quiet. Families sat together again around radios, this time listening to peace treaties instead of casualty lists. And then they looked around and realized life had changed. Forever. Women who had worked in factories were told, politely but firmly, to return home. Some did. Some didn't. After all, once you built aircraft engines and managed payrolls, folding laundry doesn't quite feel the same. The post-war years would bring their own tensions, the seeds of social change, quietly planted among the scrap metal and ration cards. But for that brief, strange moment at the end of the 1940s, the world exhaled. The Depression was gone. The war was over. The lights came back on. Of course, the next challenge was figuring out what to do with all that industry, all those people, all that purpose. Because the Depression had been a lesson in helplessness, and the war a lesson in discipline. The peace would be a test of imagination, how to build a world that could hold both prosperity and meaning without collapsing into either despair or chaos again. That's what we'll drift into next time. The post-war years, when America traded soup lines for suburbs and quiet struggle for quiet consumerism. But before we go there, what would you have done if you lived through that strange moment when war turned the world busy again? Would you have joined the lines at the factories, taken a job in an office, or just stayed home, hoping the world would slow down again one day? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know what your choice might have been. Let's rest here for a moment, the factory still humming in the distance, the lights of a new era just beginning to glow. And when you're ready, we'll drift gently into the next part, a world rebuilding itself in the ashes one quiet morning at a time. Hey everyone, welcome back. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's perfectly fine. Tonight, we're drifting into the quiet years that followed the storm, the 1950s. A decade that's remembered for its cheerfulness, its tidy lawns, and its sense of order. But underneath all that glossy optimism, there was something else, a faint hum of anxiety, like a radio left on in another room. After 15 years of crisis, first a Great Depression, then a global war, people were tired. Tired of rationing, of worry, of uncertainty. And so when peace arrived, it came with a kind of feverish energy. The world had been rebuilt out of concrete, chrome, and hope. New highways cut across old farmland. Cities stretched outward into something called suburbs, where the air smelled of fresh paint and gasoline. The factories that once made tanks and planes now made refrigerators, washing machines, and shiny toasters that could burn your breakfast in half the time. For many, it felt like stepping into a dream. A strange one, perhaps neat, repetitive, and quiet, but a dream all the same. Men came home from the war and found waiting jobs in the same factories they'd left behind. Only now the products were harmless and domestic. Steel once shaped into weapons was now turned into cars, and cars into freedom. They rolled off assembly lines in cheerful colors, mint green, pale yellow, the occasional bright red, as if the world were trying to prove it could smile again. Gas was cheap, optimism cheaper. People began to move outward, away from crowded cities, toward clean, organized neighborhoods where every house looked roughly like the next. A little white fence, a neat mailbox, and a sense that life, at last, had order. Even the birds seemed to sing on schedule. Television arrived and became everyone's new companion. It spoke in warm, friendly voices, promising happiness in 30-minute episodes. You could sit in your living room and watch tidy families laugh politely at harmless misunderstandings, while the real world, messy and unpredictable, waited just beyond the set. In kitchens, new appliances hummed softly. A refrigerator that stayed cold, without ice blocks, was practically magic. People began to collect gadgets, not because they needed them, but because they could, for a generation that had grown up making do with nothing. Owning a shiny toaster or a car that started on the first try felt like victory. The Depression had taught everyone how to live with less. Now the new lesson was how to live with more, and that wasn't always easy. Credit cards appeared. Installment plans became common. You didn't have to save up for a washing machine. You could pay for it later. And later, as it turned out, came faster than most people expected. Debt, once considered shameful, quietly became patriotic. Spending kept the economy alive. If you weren't buying something, you weren't helping. The post-war boom was a peculiar mix of comfort and pressure. There was an unspoken rule that everyone should be happy now. After all, hadn't they earned it? The war was over. The world was at peace, mostly. The economy was booming. Suburbs were spreading. If you weren't content, people looked at you as if you misplaced your gratitude somewhere. So people smiled. They mowed their lawns. They joined local clubs, hosted barbecues, and learned to make small talk about mortgages and television antennas. But sometimes late at night, they would sit quietly in their living rooms, the television off, the refrigerator humming softly, and wonder if this was really what normal was supposed to feel like. For many veterans, it was hard to settle. After years of movement, of danger, of feeling vividly alive, the calm of suburban life could feel almost too still. They didn't talk much about what they'd seen. They just mowed their lawns a little too neatly, drank a little too much, or stared at the night sky longer than they needed to. Women, too, found themselves in an odd place. During the war, they had worked in factories, offices, and shipyards. They'd earned their own pay, managed their own lives. But in the 1950s, many were told gently but firmly that their new role was back at home. The magazines were full of smiling housewives and spotless kitchens. Dinner should be ready by 6, they said. The floors should shine. Happiness was, apparently, something you could polish into existence. Of course, not everyone fit that mold. Some women quietly missed their jobs, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. They looked out their windows at the endless rows of identical houses and wondered if this was progress or just another kind of confinement. But they rarely said it out loud. That conversation would come later. The 1950s were an age of contradictions wrapped in calmness. On the surface, peace. Beneath it, tension. The Cold War had begun, which was an odd sort of war. One fought mostly with speeches, spies, and anxious silence. Children practiced hiding under desks, as though a wooden tabletop might protect them from a nuclear bomb. Families built bomb shelters in their basements, stocked with canned beans and bottled water, just in case civilization ended between breakfast and dinner. People bought maps and traced possible fallout zones while pretending it was a game. And yet, the lawns were still mowed, the cars still waxed, the casseroles still baked. Daily life went on, perfectly ordinary on the surface and vaguely surreal underneath. It was also the era of the baby boom, an explosion of new life after years of loss. Hospitals filled with newborns. Schools overflowed. There was a sense of urgency, as if the world were trying to repopulate itself faster than it could remember what had been lost. And with every new birth came new hope that maybe this time humanity would get it right. But memories have a way of lingering, even when no one speaks of them. The generation that had survived both the Depression and the war carried quiet scars. They didn't talk about trauma. That word hadn't yet found its place in daily language. They just called it being tired, or not quite yourself. And so, a kind of quiet melancholy drifted through those perfect homes, mixing with the smell of roast dinners and furniture polish. Even the architecture of the decade seemed to reflect the mood. Low, sprawling houses that kept everything on one floor, no grand staircases, no hidden attics. A world that wanted to stay flat, predictable, easy to clean. The wild energy of the 1930s and 40s was gone, replaced by order and predictability. And for most, that was exactly what they wanted, at least for a while. Television became a teacher as much as an entertainer. It told people what to wear, what to eat, how to think. News anchors with perfect hair told them the world was stable, safe, under control. Commercials whispered that happiness could be found in a better detergent or a new car. And people, weary of uncertainty, believed them, or at least wanted to. There was comfort in conformity. You didn't have to think too deeply about what came before. You just had to follow the rhythm. Work, home, family, repeat. It was a national lullaby, soothing, repetitive, and gently numbing. Of course, not everyone fit that rhythm. Artists, writers, musicians, they began to chafe against it. The Beat Generation appeared, wandering cities and highways, scribbling poems in coffee shops and asking awkward questions like, "Is this really all there is?" They were restless in a world that prized stillness. They looked at the polished suburbs and saw a kind of quiet madness. People smiling too hard, buying too much, and feeling too little. But those questions would take time to reach the mainstream. For now, the surface stayed calm. People bought televisions, cars, and hope on credit. They raised children who'd one day rebel against everything they represented. And each night, they went to sleep to the hum of modernity. Refrigerators, streetlights, the distant sound of trains. The Great Depression had been about survival. The war had been about endurance. The 1950s were about pretending everything was fine. It's not that people were unhappy. Most weren't. Exactly. They were comfortable, which is close enough. They had enough food, enough money, enough television channels. And sometimes, enough is all people can handle after chaos. So they built their worlds carefully, layer by layer, with matching curtains and polite neighbors. And behind closed doors they dreamed, some of travel, some of peace, and some quietly of change. Maybe you felt something like that, the comfort of routine that still feels a little too small. Would you have thrived in that tidy, structured world? Or would you have felt the restlessness beneath the calm? Tell me in the comments what kind of life you think you would have led in the 1950s. Would you be the perfect suburban dreamer? Or the quiet questioner with a notebook and a cup of coffee at midnight? Let's drift onward, then into the next era, the one where comfort began to crack, where the world's children grew up and started asking why everything looked perfect but felt hollow. We'll pick that up in the next part, where the sleepy calm of the 1950s gives way to the restless energy of the 1960s. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you made it this far, you're doing great. Let's get comfortable again, maybe dim the lights, settle in, and drift into the sound of the 1960s. It began, as many things do, with hope, a new decade, a young president, and a feeling that the world might finally be ready to change, for the better this time. After the polite quiet of the 1950s, the air was full of new ideas. People wanted something different, something alive. Televisions glowed in living rooms, showing a smiling man named John F., Kennedy talking about new frontiers in space and science and spirit. He seemed impossibly young compared to the leaders who'd come before, and that youth was contagious. Suddenly, the future didn't feel distant anymore. It felt possible. The early 1960s were bright, polished, and full of movement. Jet planes carried travelers across oceans. Satellites circled above. The first astronauts waved from inside shiny capsules. And ordinary people looked up at the sky and thought, maybe humanity could finally escape its old problems. But of course, the old problems didn't go away. They rarely do. They just change costumes. Beneath the bright smiles of the new decade, there was a quiet tension. In the United States, the struggle for civil rights was growing louder. Black Americans, who had been promised equality for generations, were still waiting. They marched, they sang, they were beaten, they were arrested, and they kept marching anyway. Television, for once, didn't look away. People saw the violence, the fire hoses, the police dogs. And for many who'd spent the 1950s believing everything was fine, it was a rude awakening. The suburbs weren't the whole world. Students at universities began asking questions, too, about race, about gender, about war, about the meaning of life itself. And while their parents watched quietly from behind newspaper headlines, the younger generation started to pull away from the old certainties. The polite, predictable rhythm of mid-century life began to falter. Music changed first. Rock and roll, once considered scandalous, became the heartbeat of youth. Guitars replaced dinner parties. Songs about rebellion played on the same radios that once promised household harmony. The Beatles sang about love, and somehow that felt revolutionary. Then Bob Dylan sang about change, and suddenly it wasn't just about music anymore. It was about identity, protest, and finding meaning in a noisy world. Fashion changed too. Shorter skirts, longer hair, brighter colors. It was as if the whole generation decided it was done pretending to be polite. The children of the Great Depression and the war years had raised their own children to be safe, responsible, and grateful, and instead, they'd grown up curious, skeptical, and determined to question everything. The war in Vietnam made that questioning louder. It began as a small, distant conflict, the kind of thing you might read about in the back pages of the paper. But slowly, the headlines grew larger. More troops, more casualties, more confusion about why it was happening at all. And when the draft began pulling young men straight out of college classrooms and dropping them into jungles, the anger began to rise. Television showed the war in real time. It was the first war people could watch while eating dinner. Grainy black and white footage of helicopters, smoke, and soldiers filled the screen, sandwiched between commercials for soap and cereal. The contrast was dizzying, tragedy and consumerism sharing the same broadcast. And something in the national psyche began to crack. Protests erupted on campuses. Some were peaceful, songs, speeches, flowers tucked into rifle barrels. Others turned violent. Police clashed with students, and the images flashed across television screens for everyone to see. Parents who'd once been proud of their sons and daughters for going to college now watched in disbelief as they faced off against riot squads. It was as if two generations were speaking completely different languages, one shaped by scarcity and duty, the other by abundance and doubt. At home, people argued over dinner tables. Was the war necessary? Was the rebellion justified? Was the old world really so bad? And somewhere in the background, the Cold War kept humming along, the quiet, invisible standoff between superpowers. Cuban missiles, Berlin walls, nuclear drills, reminders that the future, however bright, still had teeth. Even the dream of the perfect president shattered sooner than anyone expected. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, it felt like the air itself stopped for a moment. People stood frozen in front of televisions, unable to believe that the golden age they'd been promised had ended in a motorcade. For days, the country moved in slow motion. The funeral procession, the black veil of his widow, the endless replaying of that one terrible moment. And when it was over, nothing quite felt innocent again. The rest of the decade became a long, strange echo. Lyndon Johnson took over and tried to carry out grand reforms, civil rights laws, anti-poverty programs, all while fighting a war that seemed to consume everything. Progress and destruction marched side by side. You could get a new color television and watch history changing in real time. Marches in Washington, riots in Detroit, a man landing on the moon, and somewhere, always, another headline about casualties in Vietnam. It was an overwhelming decade, and for many people, that was the point. After years of quiet conformity, the noise felt like freedom. Young people gathered at festivals like Woodstock, barefoot, sunburned, half asleep, and certain that love and music could fix the world. They believed peace wasn't just an idea, it was a lifestyle. And for a few days, in muddy fields filled with laughter and guitar chords, almost seemed true. But peace is hard to hold on to. The end of the 1960s was darker: assassinations, riots, and growing fatigue. When Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, cities burned. When Robert Kennedy was killed shortly after, it felt like hope itself was bleeding out. The dream that had started the decade, bright, confident, modern, had turned blurry. And yet, beneath the chaos, something fundamental had shifted. The young people who marched, sang, protested, and questioned would go on to reshape the world. They'd bring new ideas about race, gender, environment, and equality. They'd invent technologies, write books, start movements. They'd carry the restlessness of the 1960s into every decade that followed. It was messy, loud, imperfect, but necessary. Every society, it seems, has to wake up eventually. And the 1960s were that long, groggy awakening from the post-war dream. Some people missed the quiet comfort of the 1950s. Others never wanted to go back. If you'd lived through it, which side do you think you'd have been on? Would you have kept the peace, kept your head down, and mowed your lawn? Or would you have marched, written, protested, searching for something more than comfort? Tell me in the comments, if you like. I always wonder which kind of dreamer people imagine themselves to be. Let's drift onward, softly, into the next part, where the idealism of the 1960s settles into the strange hangover of the 1970s. A decade of oil shortages, long lines, and quiet disillusionment. The music slows, the colors fade, and the world starts to wonder what all that change is for. So take a slow breath. By the 1950s, the world was officially out of Great Depression. The newspapers said it, the economists confirmed it, and the people, well, they nodded politely and went back to work. But the truth was, the Depression never really left anyone who lived through it. It lingered quietly in habits, in superstitions, in the way people saved old wrapping paper and rinsed out jam jars just in case. You could tell someone's age by whether they folded the aluminum foil to reuse it later. There's a kind of psychological hangover that comes from surviving deprivation. After all those years of uncertainty, of meals that were more hope than substance, people found it almost impossible to throw things away. Even as prosperity returned, kitchens still held coffee cans full of nails and buttons, and basements looked like small, well-organized museums of junk. The lesson of the 1930s had been simple: waste nothing, trust nothing, and be ready for everything to vanish again. Families who had once queued at soup kitchens now raised their children with a certain quiet paranoia. Money was to be respected. Food was sacred. Leftovers were an art form. And extravagance, well, that was for the sort of people who never learned the hard way. Even when times got good, you could still hear a faint echo of Depression logic whispering in the background. Don't count on it lasting. Let's drift over to one of the more subtle ways the Great Depression reshaped the human psyche: entertainment. When you've stared poverty in the face, you start craving softness in your stories. That's why the post-war years became so fond of sitcoms, family shows, and happy endings. The public had spent the 1930s and 40s watching tragedies unfold on the front pages. By the 1950s, they wanted a fantasy where everyone had enough to eat, and the worst problem was a teenager refusing to do chores. But even that optimism had a kind of fragility. People smiled wider, but they saved more quietly. They built suburbs with lawns and white fences, but inside their closets were boxes labeled just in case. They celebrated abundance, but feared it would disappear. And deep down, they all knew that history had a habit of circling back when you least expected it. Old habits of thrift turned into modern traditions. The coupon clippers of the Depression became the budget-conscious shoppers of the 1960s. Even when televisions and toasters filled homes, the cultural message stayed the same. Be grateful, be careful, and always have a backup plan. It's almost poetic how suffering turns into structure. People who once bartered chickens for bread now built savings accounts and bought insurance. The Depression didn't just change economies. It rewired the human sense of security. By the 1970s, a new generation came along, one that hadn't grown up in the shadow of the Depression, but in the glow of its lessons. They rebelled in small ways, spending freely, questioning authority, and rolling their eyes at their parents' obsession with saving for a rainy day. But even as they did, they inherited more than they realized. The frugality was in the water. You can't grow up in a world built by survivors without absorbing some of their caution. It's strange, isn't it? The people who had the least ended up shaping the habits of those who had the most. The Great Depression taught the world about the fragility of comfort, and that lesson never quite faded. You can still see it today in the way we panic buy bread at the slightest whisper of crisis. It's almost like a collective memory, one that sits quietly beneath modern life, reminding us not to trust abundance too much. Let's drift a little deeper into those lasting cultural ripples. Even art and literature carried traces of the Great Depression for decades. Writers and filmmakers kept circling back to stories of struggle, resilience, and the small beauty of survival. From The Grapes of Wrath to It's a Wonderful Life, every comforting narrative seemed to have an undercurrent of anxiety, a whisper that said, things could fall apart again. And maybe that's why those stories endure. Because deep down, we all recognize that the line between stability and chaos is thinner than we like to admit. The Depression had turned that fragile truth into a global inheritance. Meanwhile, governments, having seen what happens when economies collapse, began quietly building safety nets. Not perfect ones, but at least an acknowledgement that leaving people entirely to fate hadn't gone well last time. Social security, unemployment benefits, public housing, all these ideas have been born from the wreckage of the 1930s. They were the institutional version of a parent's better keep some savings tucked away. Ironically, as these systems grew stronger, people began to forget why they existed. By the late 20th century, it wasn't uncommon to hear politicians arguing that the safety nets were unnecessary. History, of course, tend to sigh quietly at that. If you ever wonder why your grandparents hoard Tupperware or keep a stash of canned beans that could survive an apocalypse, well, there's your answer. That's the ghost of the Great Depression, still tidying up in the corners of modern life. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Caution, after all, has its own quiet dignity. It reminds us that comfort is temporary, but resourcefulness can be permanent. When we think of the Great Depression, we usually picture black and white photographs, dust storms, breadlines, and worn-out shoes. But its real legacy is in color, in the small, ordinary rituals of careful living that persist even now. So if you ever rinse out a plastic container or hesitate before throwing away something that might be useful, you're participating in a tradition that goes back nearly a century. Somewhere, a 1930s grandmother would nod approvingly. History, as it turns out, doesn't just live in textbooks. It lingers in the way people think, save, and love. The Great Depression ended, but its fingerprints are on everything from economic policy to personal anxiety. And that, perhaps, is the most quietly fascinating part of it all. The worst years of modern history gave birth to the most enduring habits of everyday life. So next time you open a jar of jam and scrape every last bit from the bottom, maybe pause and think of them, the people who learned the hard way never to waste a crumb. And tell me in the comments, if you had lived through those years, would you have saved everything too? Or would you have wanted to forget it all and start fresh? Because that choice really is what defined the generations that followed. By the time the 1950s truly settled in, the world had grown tired of feeling sorry for itself. After 20 years of depression and war, people were determined to make things normal again, even if no one quite remembered what normal felt like. Cities that had been bombed flat were being rebuilt, one cautious brick at a time. Farmers who had once fled dust and debt now tended green field again. And in homes everywhere, people started buying things. Toasters, radios, sofas, The simple, miraculous pleasure of being able to afford something new made the air feel lighter. The economy was breathing again, and people were afraid to exhale too hard in case it stopped. Of course, this new world didn't spring up neatly overnight. For most families, the rebuilding was slow and full of contradictions. The same governments that had once scolded people for hoarding now encouraged them to spend, buy to support the economy. They said a sentence that would have made a 1930s farmer choke on his soup. But that's how healing worked. One cautious purchase, one repaired window, one freshly painted door at a time. It's easy to forget how many people had never known peace until then. Children born in the late 1920s had gone from soup kitchens to blackouts to air raids, and then suddenly, in the early 50s, there were ice cream trucks and televisions. The whiplash must have been something. One moment you're practicing air raid drills. The next, you're watching a smiling host sell laundry detergent on TV. Let's drift over to those early suburban neighborhoods. They popped up everywhere, like mushrooms after rain. Rows of identical houses with small lawns and even smaller fences, each one promising safety. For people who had spent decades moving, losing, and rationing, owning a tidy little home felt like winning a quiet war. The world, it seemed, was ready to rest. And yet, underneath the white picket optimism, something still twitched. You could see it in the way people double-checked their pantries, or the way they frowned when someone wasted food. You could hear it in the stories grandparents told, the ones that began with back in Depression and ended with moral lessons about thrift and hard work. Old trauma rarely disappears. It just changes clothes. That's why the 1950s obsession with perfection, the polished smiles, the spotless kitchens, the cheerful jingles, felt so forced. It was as if everyone had collectively decided that if they just acted prosperous long enough, maybe the fear would go away. It didn't, of course, but pretending was comforting. In a way, the Great Depression had taught everyone a strange kind of gratitude. Even boredom became a luxury. Think about that. After decades of chaos, the quiet monotony of mowing the lawn or watching a sitcom was a sign that life had finally calmed down. Stability, no matter how dull, was the new thrill. And yet, even as the world rebuilt itself, not everyone was invited to the celebration. Many of those who had struggled most, minorities, the poor, the displaced, found themselves still waiting at the edges of the shiny new society. Prosperity, like most good things, didn't distribute itself evenly. Factories that had once churned out tanks now made refrigerators. But they didn't always pay everyone equally. Housing booms lifted some families into comfort while leaving others behind. And the same fear that had once united people in hardship quietly turned into new divisions, who had enough and who didn't. History loves irony, and this period was full of it. The same governments that had learned compassion during the Depression now began to forget. Safety nets were trimmed, wages stagnated, and somewhere between abundance and amnesia, the world began repeating its old patterns, very politely and with better wallpaper. Still, for the average person, daily life was gentler. You could plan for the future again. People talked about careers instead of survival. Children grew up believing the world would always provide as long as they followed the rules. It was a comforting illusion, and for a while, it almost seemed true. Let's drift now to one of the quieter joys of the post-war years, domestic ritual. Housewives clipped recipes from magazines that promised modern efficiency. Men washed their cars on Sundays, as though shining chrome could ward off bad luck. Even the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning felt symbolic, proof that things were back on track. Of course, progress comes with paperwork. Governments, flush with optimism, began recording, taxing, and planning more than ever before. Bureaucracy became the new empire, but no one complained much. After decades of uncertainty, people found comfort in forms and numbers. Order, even tedious order, was preferable to chaos. And so, life settled into patterns. Predictable, safe, slightly dull. But after what humanity had been through, dullness was almost romantic. In Europe, reconstruction took longer. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and London wore their scars for decades. But beneath the rubble, Communities rebuilt with a quiet determination that only those who've lost everything can understand. They planted gardens in bomb craters. They opened shops in half-standing buildings. They made tea among ruins and called to progress. Meanwhile, in America, something else was happening: the birth of consumer culture. For the first time, people began defining themselves by what they bought rather than what they survived. Advertising replaced hardship as the national obsession. And if you couldn't afford something, credit cards were ready to help you pretend. It's a bit tragic in a funny way. The same people who once mended their shoes until they fell apart now bought new ones just because they were on sale. Economists called it growth. Psychologists might have called it overcompensation. But that's human nature, isn't it? We swing from scarcity to excess like a pendulum that never quite finds its center. Still, not everything was shallow. Beneath the shiny surface, there was a quiet sense of appreciation. People who had seen true hardship didn't take comfort for granted. They might have enjoyed new cars and televisions, but they also noticed small miracles: running water, a full pantry, a day without worry. And slowly, the lessons of the Depression faded into instinct. Parents stopped talking about making do. Children stopped remembering ration cards. History, as it often does, slipped quietly out the back door. But even then, every now and then, a moment of unease would creep in. A bank closing early, a rumor of inflation, a sudden strike, and you could almost hear the old ghost of 1932 whispering, "Don't get too comfortable." Because the truth is, societies never fully recover from something like the Great Depression. They just learn to hide the scars better. Let's drift a little closer to those scars. By the 1960s and 70s, new movements were rising: civil rights, feminism, youth rebellion. They were all, in their own way, reactions to the comfort and conformity that had grown from the ashes of the Depression. The grandchildren of the Dust Bowl were now marching, questioning, demanding more than stability. They wanted meaning. It's fascinating, really. Hardship breeds resilience, and resilience eventually breeds curiosity. Once people stop worrying about survival, they start asking why things are the way they are. That's how change begins. Quietly, with sigh rather than a shout. By the time the 1980s arrived, the Depression was something you learned about in school, not something you felt in your bones. The world had traded fear for convenience and thrift for excess. Yet, under all that progress, a subtle anxiety remained, an inherited unease that no amount of consumerism could erase. Maybe that's the real legacy of the Great Depression. Not poverty, but perspective. A reminder, passed down through families and institutions, that nothing, absolutely nothing, stays stable forever. So as we look back on the world that rebuilt itself, we can admire its optimism, its courage, and its sometimes hilarious denial of history. But we can also see ourselves reflected in it, always balancing between remembering and forgetting, saving and spending, fearing and hoping. If you had lived in those years of Reconstruction after the long shadow of the Depression and war, what would you have done differently? Would you have spent freely to forget, or saved carefully to remember? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to know how you think you'd have rebuilt your life from the ruins. So here we are, at the soft edge of the story. The world has survived the Great Depression, rebuilt itself after war, and moved into an age of noise, comfort, and plenty. But if you listen closely, beneath the hum of televisions and the chatter of modern life, you can still hear something faint, a whisper, a small reminder of what once was. The Great Depression didn't end so much as it faded into memory. It sank into the background of families, into the way people folded money carefully or kept a spare can of beans in the cupboard. It became less a story and more a feeling, something passed down quietly between generations. In the decade that followed, the world grew busier, brighter, and louder. Skyscrapers rose where breadlines once stood. Shopping malls replaced relief centers. The dusty hunger of the 1930s turned into the polished hunger for more. More things, more progress, more comfort. The pendulum had swung again. But history never really lets go. It just waits patiently for us to notice it. The people who had lived through the Depression grew old. Many of them didn't talk much about it. Not because they'd forgotten, but because it sat too deep. Ask them what it was like, and they'd usually shrug and say, "We got by." That was their version of a war story. And maybe it was enough. They watched younger generations grow restless. People who had never seen an empty store shelf, who thought struggling meant waiting too long in traffic. You could almost sense the older folks biting their tongues, remembering a world where even milk was a luxury. But they didn't scold. They just carried on quietly, with the same quiet pride that had seen them through the worst. Let's drift for a moment into one of those small-town kitchens. It's the 1970s now. There's a grandmother there, standing at the stove, making soup out of leftovers. Her children have told her she doesn't need to do that anymore. You can buy more, they say. She smiles, says nothing, and keeps stirring. Because to her, that thrift isn't poverty. It's dignity. It's a reminder that life can turn again, and when it does, she'll be ready. That's the strange gift of the Great Depression. It taught millions of people how to endure, not just with grim determination, but with grace. They learned how to make beauty out of scarcity, how to laugh at misfortune, and how to take pride in surviving the day. Those lessons don't go out of style, no matter how modern the world becomes. You can still see them if you know where to look. In every community garden, in every hand-me-down, in every neighbor who checks in on another, just in case. It's the ghost of resilience, still walking quietly among us. And, of course, we've had our own reminders. Economic recessions, pandemics, shortages. Each time, society panics briefly, then remembers how to adapt. We plant, we save, we improvise. We learn again what the 1930s already knew, that comfort is temporary, but community is everything. Let's drift onward, softly, to what happened after the Great Depression's children grew up. They built the modern world. Highways, suburbs, universities, corporations. But even as they did, their instincts stayed humble. They worked hard, feared debt, and trusted the idea that effort could still matter. Somewhere along the way, though, the balance shifted again. By the late 20th century, the grandchildren of the Depression had become the architects of plenty. They grew up with color TVs, fast food, and disposable everything. The idea of saving string or reusing foil seemed almost funny. And yet, when the economy wobbled, as it always does, you could see the old behaviors creeping back like an instinct that refuses to die. It's almost comforting, really. Human nature might be forgetful, but it's not hopeless. The wisdom of survival never disappears completely. It just naps between crises. If the Great Depression taught us anything lasting, it was humility, the kind that says, we are not invincible. The world can break, and we can still keep going. That's not despair. That's endurance with a touch of humor. The quiet kind that lets you face an empty pantry and say, well, I've been here before. And that attitude, more than any government program or economic theory, is what rebuilt the world. The slow courage of ordinary people. The patience of those who kept trying when everything told them not to. It's strange how invisible real heroism can be. The Great Depression didn't have many grand victories or monuments. Its heroes didn't wear uniforms. They just endured. They mended. They shared. They hoped. And that's why their story still matters. Because it's ours too. Every generation has its own version of hard times. They just look different. Sometimes cleaner. Sometimes quieter. But the same questions remain. How do we take care of each other when there's not enough to go around? How do we keep dignity when everything else is gone? The people of the 1930s answered those questions the only way anyone ever can. Together, they built a new sense of community out of shared hardship. Neighbors became lifelines, strangers became allies, and kindness became a form of rebellion. And maybe that's the part of their story worth remembering most. Not the hunger or the dust, but the strange, stubborn kindness that survived it all. Let's drift a little further. To the present day, the world now feels bigger and faster, but underneath it, the same fragile system hums away, the one that can wobble with few bad choices or unlucky turns. The ghost of the Great Depression would recognize the signs, the endless chase for growth, the debts that pile up quietly, the optimism that forgets its own history. And yet, they'd probably smile too, because for all our flaws, humanity has a remarkable habit of rebuilding itself. Over and over again, Each time, a little wiser. Each time, a little more compassionate, at least for a while. That's the rhythm of history. Hardship, recovery, amnesia, repeat. It's not graceful, but it's human. The Great Depression was, in many ways, a terrible teacher, but it taught lessons worth keeping. That wealth is fleeting, that generosity matters, and that survival isn't just about food, it's about hope. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe think of them, the people who made do, who kept faith in small things, who found laughter in scarcity. They built the quiet foundations of the world we live in now. And if someday the world stumbles again, maybe we'll remember them, not with fear, but with calm, because we've done it before and we'll do it again. The Great Depression, after all, wasn't just an economic event. It was a long meditation on what it means to be human, resilient, foolish, generous, and endlessly adaptable. If you could ask one of those Depression survivors a question, what would it be? Would you want to know how they found hope? Or what they would think of our noisy digital world? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts before we close the book. And as always, if you've drifted this far with me, thank you. You're part of this quiet little corner of the internet where history slows down long enough to rest. If you enjoyed the journey, leave a soft like, share it with someone who needs a calm night, and subscribe for more sleepy history stories. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, even in the hardest times, people still found a way to dream. Good night. Crescent Moon.